We begin every argument with an instrument already in our hands. Before we weigh evidence, before we divide the possible from the impossible, before we pronounce judgment upon matter, mind, or God, we trust the power by which judgments are made. Reason enters the chamber not merely as a witness but as the judge. Yet there is an unsettling question waiting at the door. What if this judge was fashioned chiefly for survival, not for impartial knowledge? A mind may guide behavior successfully without disclosing the whole truth of things. A mental map need not contain every mountain, boundary, or hidden road in order to keep a creature from danger. It may simplify the territory, omit what does not matter to immediate action, even distort scale and distance, while still directing the traveler toward shelter and away from death. Usefulness is real. Survival is no illusion. But usefulness and truth are not identical kingdoms. The power to remain alive does not by itself explain the power to know what is ultimately real. Here the intellectual battle turns inward. If one concludes that nothing exists beyond the material order, that conclusion has been reached by reasoning. The argument for materialism therefore depends upon the trustworthiness of the very faculty whose origin materialism seeks to explain. If thought is only an instrument selected because it produced successful behavior, why should we trust it when it ventures far beyond the fields in which survival tested it into logic, mathematics, metaphysics, moral obligation, and the nature of existence itself? The weapon must be examined before its victories are celebrated. Yet we must resist an easy and counterfeit triumph. To say that a belief has evolutionary origins is not to say that it is false. Hunger has a history, but food remains real. Sight may serve survival precisely because it reveals genuine features of the world. The origin of a reasoning faculty and the justification for trusting that faculty are connected questions, but they are not the same question. A pedigree is not a refutation. The real issue is whether a purely material genealogy can support the wide confidence that rational inquiry requires, or whether it explains practical success while leaving deeper warrant unsecured. We must therefore hear the strongest naturalistic reply, not a weakened substitute designed for effortless defeat. And when the theistic account enters, it must face the same severity. Does it truly explain the harmony of mind, world, and rational obligation, or merely give the mystery another name? Our aim is not to frighten reason into surrender, but to discover which vision of reality gives reason a rightful home. Before the battlefield can be judged, however, its boundaries must be drawn, for a conflict conducted with undefined words produces only noise, and a victory won against shadows is no victory at all. Let us begin, then, not with conclusions but with terms. By the materialist account, we mean that minds arise wholly through physical processes, biological history, and interaction with an environment. No prior rational intention stands behind nature. Consciousness and reasoning emerge within an order that was not itself arranged for the sake of thought. This definition does not require the materialist to despise reason, deny truth, or reduce every conviction to conscious self-interest. It states only the explanatory boundary within which the account must work. By theism, we mean something equally minimal. Finite minds exist within a reality grounded in a fundamental rational source. Nothing specifically Christian has yet been established. No doctrine of revelation, redemption, or providence may be taught into the argument before it has been earned. The claim under examination is narrower, that rationality belongs to the foundation of reality rather than appearing only as a late consequence within it. Nor must reliability be confused with perfection. A mind may be reliable enough for ordinary action while remaining mistaken about much. It may be generally directed toward truth without reaching truth in every judgment, and it may possess genuine knowledge without being infallible. The argument requires neither flawless perception nor immunity from bias. If materialism had to explain an errorless mind, it would be condemned by an impossible standard. If theism promised such a mind merely because its source is rational, it would be contradicted by the errors we already know. A further distinction is equally necessary. The causes of a belief are the events and processes that produced it. The reasons for a belief are the considerations that make it worthy of acceptance. These must not be collapsed. Learning how a conviction arose does not settle whether it is true. Yet neither may they be severed entirely, because the history of a faculty can matter when we ask whether its outputs deserve trust. Origin is not verdict, but origin may still bear upon credibility. The comparison must therefore proceed under common standards, internal coherence, the preservation of rational inquiry, explanatory reach, and an honest treatment of error. Can each account explain why reasoning succeeds, why it sometimes fails, and why we remain answerable to standards that expose the failure? Neither side receives immunity from these questions. This direct comparison deserves explicit treatment, partly because discussion of God and mind often leaves this precise issue sparsely examined. But neglect is not evidence for theism. It is only a reason to investigate carefully. The question remains comparative and explanatory. Which worldview gives the more coherent account of reason as fallible yet truth-seeking? With the rivals and the rules now defined, we may confront the first confusion, the belief that discovering where a thought came from tells us whether it is true. The confusion is tempting because it wears the appearance of explanation. We discover that a conviction was encouraged by hunger, sharpened by fear, reinforced by social pressure, embodied in neurons, or inherited through evolutionary history. Then, almost without noticing the change, we treat the causal account as though it were a refutation. But to explain why a person came to believe something is not yet to determine whether the thing believed is true. Causes produce beliefs. Reasons justify them. A complete history of the first cannot substitute for an examination of the second. Consider a ruler bearing the stamp of the factory that produced it. The stamp may tell us where the instrument came from, what process formed it, and perhaps what standard of manufacture we ought to expect. Yet no inscription, merely by being an inscription of origin, settles whether the ruler measures accurately. Calibration requires comparison with an independent standard. Provenance may become relevant to confidence, but provenance is not itself accuracy or inaccuracy. The question is not simply who made the ruler, but whether the process of making it gave us an instrument answerable to the measure it claims to disclose. The same discipline must govern our treatment of thought. On a materialist account, every conscious inference has physical conditions, neural activity, bodily states, inherited capacities, and environmental causes. But describing those conditions does not replace the logical content of the inference. An account of electrical and chemical events does not, merely by being complete at its own level, tell us whether a conclusion follows from its premises. Material realization and rational validity are not rival descriptions of the same kind. One tells us how an act of thinking occurs. The other asks whether the thought is worthy of assent. And yet origins cannot be dismissed as wholly irrelevant. If we learn that a belief-producing process was indifferent to truth, or systematically hostile to it, confidence in its products would reasonably weaken. Fear may sometimes reveal danger, but it may also manufacture it. Social agreement may transmit knowledge, but it may also preserve error. A causal history becomes epistemically significant when it gives us reason to suspect that truth and belief have been pulled apart. The serious dispute, therefore, is not whether matter can participate in reasoning as though naming neurons were enough to banish logic. It is whether non-rational causes can adequately account for creatures who track truth with general reliability, recognize binding rational norms, and distinguish what they happen to think from what they ought to think. A material origin is not an undermining defeater until a further argument exposes a troubling distance between adaptive success and truth. That distance has not yet been established. Naturalism must now be allowed to make its strongest reply. Survival and truth are often not enemies, but allies. The naturalistic reply begins with a fact too plain to be dismissed. A creature that regularly confuses a cliff with a passage, a predator with an innocent shape, or nourishment with poison will not long act with success. Movement requires distinction. Pursuit requires prediction. Escape requires some grasp of distance, direction, and danger. However incomplete the creature's awareness may be, useful action commonly depends upon contact with the actual structures of its surroundings. This alliance reaches beyond bare perception. An animal must often register causes, anticipate recurring patterns, distinguish one agent from another, and revise its expectations when familiar conditions change. A rigid instinct may succeed where the environment remains stable, but flexible learning becomes valuable when food moves, threats alter, seasons turn, or old responses cease to work. The capacity to compare, remember, infer, and correct can therefore possess genuine adaptive power. On such an account, general reasoning is not an inexplicable ornament attached to survival. It is an extension of the ability to navigate a world whose patterns are real. Nor does cognition remain imprisoned within the solitary individual. Language permits one mind to preserve what another has learned. Memory carries discoveries beyond the moment of danger. Criticism exposes contradictions, measurement disciplines impression. Repeated testing separates an attractive guess from a dependable expectation. Communities can preserve error, as we have already admitted, but they can also identify and correct it. Naturalism may therefore appeal not only to biological selection, but also to accumulated practices that reward successful prediction, public comparison, and revision under pressure from reality. A further objection must also be resisted. A capacity shaped for practical problems need not remain confined to its earliest employment. Once minds can represent relations, combine symbols, imagine alternatives, and follow implications, those powers may be redirected. Mathematics, metaphysics, and cosmology need not have been immediate objects of selection for the capacities used in them to possess later value. Origin does not dictate an eternal boundary around application. A faculty first advantageous in ordinary life may be refined, extended, and placed under disciplines far removed from the circumstances in which it arose. This does not show that evolution guarantees truth, that every adaptive belief is accurate, or that cultural correction cannot itself go astray. It shows something more modest and more important. Naturalism has a coherent pathway from successful action to substantial cognitive reliability. The argument from reason cannot win by declaring fitness wholly indifferent to truth, because much adaptive success appears to require sufficiently accurate representation, learning, prediction, and correction. Naturalism has therefore survived the easiest assault. The contest must move to a narrower and more demanding ground. Selection encounters behavior directly. Beliefs and inferences stand behind that behavior. The next question is whether practical contact with reality warrants broad confidence when reason turns toward truths remote from action, and whether the same successful conduct might sometimes arise from very different, even mistaken understandings of the world. Naturalism is strongest where action meets resistance from the world. Yet even here we must distinguish what selection directly rewards from what it only indirectly favors. Reproductive success and effective behavior are exposed to consequences. Propositions are not displayed before nature for inspection and marked true or false. Beliefs matter because of what creatures do through them, but successful action may constrain an understanding without uniquely determining it. Contact with reality can be genuine, while the account given of that reality remains partial, confused, or philosophically inadequate. Consider, strictly as a thought experiment, two agents who avoid the same danger. One withdraws because it recognizes the danger for what it is and desires safety. The other withdraws because it misunderstands what confronts it but combines that error with an equally unusual desire that produces the same movement. Both survive. This does not suggest that such combinations are common, biologically likely, or stable across many circumstances. It establishes only a logical point. Behavior alone does not always reveal which beliefs and desires generated it. The more flexible and widely successful the conduct, the stronger the evidence for accurate representation becomes. Yet no sequence of useful outcomes automatically supplies a complete theory of what is real. We must therefore separate local dependability from universal warrant. Ordinary perception may be trustworthy within familiar conditions because error there is repeatedly punished. But abstract logic, metaphysics, moral norms, and a total account of reality are not merely enlarged versions of finding what helps or avoiding what harms. They concern necessity, validity, obligation, and existence as such. A faculty competent in daily judgment may indeed reach these heights, but its success below does not by itself certify every inference made above. Cultural correction greatly strengthens the naturalistic case, but it does not wholly remove this burden. Experiments, criticism, shared inquiry, and reinterpretation can expose individual error. Nevertheless, every observation must be recognized, every criticism understood, every result interpreted, and every correction inferred by minds employing the same general cognitive equipment. Social discipline can refine reason. It cannot step wholly outside reason to guarantee it. The challenge, then, is narrow but unavoidable. Naturalism need not predict widespread delusion, nor must falsehood usually serve survival. It need only explain why capacities shaped through practical success deserve expansive confidence when they pronounce upon realities no behavior could fully test. And materialism cannot watch this question from a safe distance, for materialism is itself an abstract conclusion about the whole order of existence. If its reasoning powers are adequate to reach that conclusion, the account must show how adaptive adequacy became truth-governed warrant. Yet a deeper difficulty now appears. Can any worldview establish such trust without already using the reason whose authority it seeks to establish? There is no escape from this self-involvement. Any proof that reason is trustworthy must arrange premises, draw distinctions, and reach a conclusion. It must use reason at every step. Nor can doubt provide a neutral refuge. For doubt also compares possibilities, detects insufficiency, and judges what ought not yet be believed. There is no balcony outside all thought from which thought may be inspected without thinking. The demand that reason first secure itself by some wholly non-rational certificate is therefore not rigorous. It is impossible. But this unavoidable dependence must not be confused with every vicious circle. We regularly employ a basic faculty while examining whether it operates consistently, whether it conflicts with other knowledge, and whether particular conditions distort its results. Such testing cannot begin from nowhere. Its circularity is benign because it reflects the structure of inquiry itself. Destructive circularity appears only when the account offered for a faculty supplies positive grounds for distrusting the faculty's deliverances. The problem is not that reason participates in its own examination, but that its alleged history or constitution may place its authority under suspicion. Imagine a court hearing a case concerning its own jurisdiction. It cannot conduct the hearing without exercising the very authority being questioned. That fact alone does not invalidate the proceedings. Otherwise, no court could ever consider the limits of its power. Yet evidence that the judges were corrupted, that the records had been systematically altered, or that verdicts were governed by interests unrelated to justice would matter profoundly. Self-involvement is unavoidable. Corruption is not. The proper question is therefore not whether the court acts as a court, but whether what we learn about it defeats our confidence in its judgments. The same standard must govern both rival accounts. The naturalist need not produce an external proof of reason, for no worldview can do so. But naturalism must show that evolutionary formation, practical selection, and cultural correction do not together give us a strong reason to suspect that our broadest convictions are governed by adaptive usefulness while masquerading as truth. Theism, however, may not merely pronounce the words rational creator and consider the matter settled. It must explain why such a source should yield finite minds genuinely directed toward truth, why rational norms possess authority, and why invoking divine reason illuminates our trust rather than simply renaming it. The possible verdict remains modest. An account may be epistemically unstable without containing a formal contradiction. It may weaken the confidence required to affirm itself without making every conclusion drawn within it false. Another account may offer greater explanatory harmony without becoming mathematically certain. Comparative dissatisfaction is not disproof, and comparative strength is not demonstration. We must therefore abandon the fantasy of certainty achieved from nowhere. Ordinary rational life proceeds by warranted confidence, trust supported by coherence, experience, correction, and the absence of serious defeaters, yet always open to revision. The decisive issue is not whether reason begins by trusting reason. Every inquiry does. It is whether a worldview makes that trust intelligible or quietly dissolves the ground beneath it. With that standard secured, the proposal of a rational source behind nature may now be heard, but it must earn, not assume, its explanatory place. The theistic proposal begins with a reversal. Reason is not a late stranger entering a reality that was mindless at its foundation. It is a finite expression of an order in which rationality is already fundamental. Human thought remains dependent, embodied, and limited, yet it does not confront the universe as something wholly alien to its own nature. The thinker and the world thought about arise from a common rational source. This offers a possible account of the remarkable fit between knower and known. The world presents patterns capable of discovery, relations capable of description, and structures capable of being understood. The mind, for its part, can recognize those patterns, test descriptions against experience, and correct itself when its judgments fail. If both the intelligibility of nature and the intelligence of the investigator belong within one prior rational order, their correspondence is no longer a fortunate meeting between two unrelated accidents. It becomes, at least in principle, what such an account would lead us to expect. The same proposal bears upon the authority of logic. When thinkers move from grounds to conclusions, they do not merely report what their brains happen to do. They distinguish valid movement from invalid movement, consistency from contradiction, what follows from what does not. Rational norms, therefore, confront us not simply as habits, but as standards. We may violate them, misunderstand them, or discover our failure only after long inquiry. Nevertheless, we judge our thinking by them. Theism can interpret this obligation as participation in a rational order that precedes our private preferences and biological impulses. Yet this does not require the denial of brains, bodies, or evolutionary history. The contrast concerns ultimate grounding, not immediate mechanism. A theist may accept that reasoning depends upon neural processes and that human cognitive capacities developed through biological history, while still maintaining that this history unfolds within a reality whose foundation is rational and whose order permits finite minds to know it. Physical vibration is necessary for embodied hearing, and the construction of an instrument shapes the sound produced. But an inventory of wood, string, metal, and motion does not exhaust the relations by which notes form melody or discord. Mechanism can describe the performance without settling the source or authority of its order. Here lies the explanatory attraction. Theism may gather consciousness, an intelligible world, and binding rational norms into one account, making rational trust less surprising than it would be if reason were foreign to reality's foundation. But attraction is not demonstration. A common source must do more than place three mysteries beneath one name. It must explain why divine rationality should yield finite knowers capable of truth, and why those knowers are also vulnerable to confusion, bias, disagreement, and profound error. Before restrained wonder becomes premature certainty, the created mind must be examined at its fractures. The objection now becomes severe. If human minds were intended for truth, why are they so easily conquered by bias, delusion, tribal loyalty, disordered desire, and confident mistake? Why do sincere thinkers examine the same question and depart with incompatible conclusions? A rational source may make knowledge possible, but possibility is not enough. Theism must account not merely for the light by which we see, but for the shadows our seeing produces. A mirror may offer a genuine reflection without offering a complete one. Its frame excludes much of the room. Its angle emphasizes one object and conceals another. Damage may bend an image without extinguishing it. So too, created reason might be limited without being fraudulent. Fallibility does not entail total blindness. Yet the cracks cannot be praised as though they were part of the clarity. If distortion is deep, recurring, and difficult to detect, then any account of the mirror must explain both its luminosity and its wounds. Theism possesses several possible resources. Finitude may explain why no human knower comprehends the whole. Embodiment may explain why attention is selective and judgment affected by fatigue, appetite, fear, and circumstance. Freedom may permit the refusal of unwelcome truth. Disordered desire may bend reasoning toward conclusions the will already favors. Dependence upon communal correction may explain why knowledge advances through criticism, testimony, patience, and revision rather than through isolated certainty. But these are components of an answer, not verified facts that dissolve the problem. Each must be connected coherently to the world we actually encounter. Nor may the word God become a verbal fortress into which every unanswered question retreats. To place a mysterious mind behind human minds does not automatically explain why rational norms bind them. The theist must show how a rational source makes intelligibility, obligation, and correction belong together, rather than merely moving the mystery upward. Coherence is required, not an ornamental stopping point. Religious disagreement sharpens the difficulty. If reality has a rational source, and human minds are directed toward truth, it remains striking that metaphysical judgment is neither immediate nor uniform. Divine hiddenness presses in the same direction. Whatever else theism may say, it cannot lightly promise that a creator guarantees obvious knowledge of the creator. Neither may unexplained consciousness or rational normativity be seized as automatic evidence for whichever supernatural conclusion one prefers. Ignorance is not a bridge to a chosen doctrine. A gap in one account is not yet the triumph of another. Theism can therefore accommodate fallible reason, but not without cost, qualification, and unfinished labor. Its account of limited, embodied, morally vulnerable knowers may preserve genuine rational trust while explaining error. Yet the completeness of that explanation must now be weighed against the naturalistic account under the same discipline. The contest has reached the point where neither side should posture as conqueror. Both must stand together before one tribunal and answer for the combined pattern. Reason succeeds, reason fails, and even in failure remains answerable to truth. The comparison must begin where every world view is most exposed. Can it affirm the reasoning by which it is accepted, without giving us substantial cause to distrust that reasoning? Neither account may demand certainty unavailable to the other, and neither must eliminate every mystery before it can be judged coherent. The question is one of comparative fit. Which account preserves the act of rational judgment while explaining its power, its authority, and its failures? Naturalism has earned more than a dismissive hearing. It offers a plausible account of creatures whose perceptions answer to environmental pressures, whose learning improves conduct, and whose errors may be corrected through experience, criticism, and shared inquiry. This achievement must not be erased merely because it is incomplete. Practical reliability is genuine reliability, and cultural correction can extend it far beyond the conditions in which our earliest capacities were formed. Yet the burden remains. Fitness rewards successful life within an environment. Rational judgment reaches toward logical necessity, abstract truth, moral obligation, and reality considered as a whole. Naturalism must explain how capacities selected through action acquire warrant in domains where action cannot deliver a final test. It may succeed in doing so, but it cannot merely assume that adaptive usefulness and truth-governed reasoning are interchangeable. Theism faces the opposite pressure. By grounding mind and world in a rational source, it makes their correspondence less accidental and gives binding rational norms a possible home beyond preference or survival. But it inherits serious questions. Why should the rational source create finite knowers? Why should their access to truth be obscured by error, desire, disagreement, and hiddenness? And what warrants calling this source God, rather than assigning a grand name to what remains unexplained? Thus, the verdict is not produced by premises that compel every reasonable mind. It is an inference from explanatory scope, coherence, and cost. Naturalism explains much about the practical formation and correction of thought, but its passage from fitness to expansive rational warrant remains contested. Theism places consciousness, intelligibility, and rational obligation within a more unified order, but only while accepting unfinished labor concerning divine intention and human fallibility. A measured judgment is therefore possible. Rational trust may count as evidence favoring theism because reason appears less alien, less accidental, and more intelligible within a reality rational at its foundation. But evidence is not compulsion, and comparative advantage is not solitary proof. This argument neither disproves naturalism nor establishes God by itself. It contributes weight to a cumulative case. The final question is no longer how to claim victory, but how a fallible thinker should live under the responsibility of seeking truth. We return, then, to the unease with which the inquiry began. The mind is embodied, evolved, socially influenced, and fallible. None of this requires us to dismiss it. A history of dependence is not a sentence of futility. Indeed, the very act of identifying our influences, exposing our biases, and revising our conclusions already testifies that causation does not imprison judgment. We are affected by forces we did not choose, yet we can ask whether their effects deserve assent. The proper response is neither coronation nor contempt. Reason is not a sovereign power that created itself, guarantees its own innocence, and owes allegiance to nothing beyond its verdicts. But neither is it chemical noise accidentally imagining truth while possessing no capacity to reach it. To enthrone reason is to forget its failures. To degrade it is to make even that degradation intellectually meaningless. Grounded confidence stands between these extremes. It trusts because inquiry genuinely discloses truth, and it remains humble because every human act of knowing is limited, corrigible, and vulnerable to desire. Under theism, this posture becomes participation rather than possession. We do not manufacture intelligibility. We awaken within an intelligible order and learn, slowly, to answer it. Reasoning is therefore exercised with gratitude, discipline, criticism, patience, and the willingness to be corrected. Confidence in a rational source does not make evidence unnecessary. It makes intellectual honesty a duty. The skeptic need not abandon unanswered objections. Questions about hiddenness, suffering, disagreement, and the nature of divine mind retain their force. Yet one further question deserves to accompany them. Does our reliance upon rational obligation fit more naturally within a reality grounded in reason, or within a reality ultimately indifferent to whether any conclusion is true? This is not a demand for surrender. It is an invitation to examine the trust already active in the examination. The questioning Christian faces an equal responsibility. God must not become a shortcut around evidence, an excuse for weak inference, or protection against revision. If reality has a rational source, then carelessness is not faithfulness. To distort an opponent, conceal a difficulty, or claim certainty where only probability is available is to dishonor the truth one professes to serve. We end, therefore, without intellectual triumph and without despair. Perhaps the deepest wonder is not that finite minds sometimes fail. Given our limits, failure should not astonish us. The wonder is that we can recognize failure as failure, submit preference to a truth we did not invent, correct one another, and begin again. Reason is secure not when it declares itself invulnerable, but when it remains answerable, and each honest act of inquiry leaves us with the quiet question, what kind of reality makes such answerability possible?